Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Worship and Word Conversations. Listen, if you have been with us for several weeks, you know how this works. If this is your first time joining us, you're in the right spot for conversations relative to practical Christianity. How do we make sense of the word that God shares with us and live it out? So this is Conversations, Worship and Word Conversations. I know on Friday nights we have soul-stirring music. We have dynamic preaching and testimonies. This is just dinner conversations around relevant topics. So you're in the right space. Here's what I need you to do, folks, as you're joining us, and we're about to introduce our guests, our fantastic guests who are joining us. I need you in the comment section, and the Horn family from Waldorf, Maryland has already started us off. In the comment section, let us know where you're joining us from. And if you even want to shout out your church or your faith community, I know some people like to shout out their pastor. Feel free to do that in the comment section. We'll have a lot of fun in the comment section today on Worship and Word Conversations. And I know our guests are going to say something that sparks a question or maybe a challenge or maybe even a little bit of pushback from you. Feel free to do that in the comment section. As long as we're respectful to each other, we can have a good time there. All right. So let's introduce our guests. I want you to get to know them a bit better as we begin our conversation. And we'll start with you, Seth. Give us an idea of where you're from, where you're tuning in, joining us from, and what you're up to.
Cool. Thank you for having me. My name is Seth Pierce. I am currently a professor at Union College. I teach in the communication program as well as some religion. I grew up in Minnesota and actually did my undergrad at Union College in theology, did my MDiv at Andrews, and pastored for 16 years, both small churches, large churches, an associate, a large church as a lead pastor. And then just this last year, finished my PhD in communication and accepted a position at Union College.
Seth, we're glad that you are with us. And we have people on from Mexico, from Boston, from Pennsylvania, from Maryland, from BOL. So we thank all of you who are joining us as well. And as you are coming in, feel free in the comment section to let us know where you're joining us from so that we can shout you out. Jay North, talk to us, man. Where are you located and what do you do there?
Yeah, so I'm in Huntsville, Alabama. On the campus of Oakwood University, and I work in the area of youth and young adults, the associate pastor, one of the associate pastors, but my responsibility is youth and young adults and social media for the Oakwood University Church and a little bit with Breath of Life television ministries as well. So I've pastored, worked on the conference level a little bit in our faith organization, and just enjoy ministry. But now I'm boots on the ground once again.
Thanks for joining us, Pastor Jay North. And we have Kathy all the way from Washington State hanging out with us as well. And Kanique from Huntsville. She throw her hands up, says Huntsville. My friend, Miss Debbie Michelle, talk to us about where you are and what you're up to.
All righty. First of all, thank you, Pierre. I'm excited about this. Feels like a reunion. I'm seeing some familiar faces, so really excited about this. So I am currently at the Lake Union Conference, where I serve as Associate Communication Director and Managing Editor of the Lake Union Herald. And prior to that, I was at Andrews University as a professor. So Seth, I can relate to you with the teaching part of it. And then actually while I was teaching there, Chris was in the communication department and you, Pierre, was in the communication department. Kevin, you were a student. And so this is really great. And I did that for, how long did I teach? 7 years before going over to the Union. And then before that had a whole other life in New York City. Working in journalism. So that's it in a nutshell.
We got to crack open the nut just a little bit more to give people some frame of reference. You said a whole nother life in journalism in New York City, putting it mildly and super humble. I know that's who you are, but kind of give us a little bit with the flashlight of what
you know what it
is.
It feels like a whole other world. It really does. And so I worked in television news with NBC News for 11 years at 30 Rock. They're in the heart of Manhattan, and worked on shows like Nightly News, with Tom Brokaw, was the anchor at the time, and Dateline NBC. So that's it.
Okay.
A little
All right.
more.
And we'll get to a little bit more in a few moments after we finish off our introductions. Chris Bartley, give us a little bit about you, where you're joining us from, and what you're up to.
What's going on, everyone? Let's see. What's the most relevant for today, man? And user experience designer in healthcare, working on a startup, focusing on expert networks. Honestly, there really isn't much. I don't even think there's a space for that in Miami, Florida. I think it's really a global thing right now. You know, companies like GLG or Alpha Sites. So that's going to be an interesting space. And the Anti-Hero Project, you know, after our seminars from before, that's something that I'm trying to figure out how to work that in. And I think it's going to be a good discussion for this right here. But that's pretty much helping gifted individuals or leaders who have misappropriated those talents and have had really a Samson experience, you know, or the Darth Vader experience. And they come around full circle, kind of helping them through their own narrative so that they can just restore themselves from shame back to honor. So, yep.
I like how you slipped in a pop culture reference there. Yeah. Real smooth, my man. Real smooth. Finally, my friend Kevin Wilson, Pastor Kevin Wilson, bro, give us a little bit about where you are and what you do there.
Right. No, thank you so much for this opportunity. This is such a cool experience. So right now I'm in San Diego, California. I've been pastoring here for about, I would say, just coming on 3 years now, at the Oceanside Seventh Adventist Church, North County, San Diego, if you're familiar with the area. Right before this, I just finished my MDiv at Andrews. Before that, my bachelor's. I'm what they call a third culture kid. Kind of grew up in so many different places. I grew up in Sri Lanka, and then the Middle East, and then the States. So I did my elementary school in Sri Lanka, the high school in Oman, in Dubai, and then my high school college experience at Andrews. So it's kind of like a cultural mutt. So that's kind of like a little bit of a background that I have. That's kind of the gist of what I'm into right now. Got married recently, so yeah, I'm doing it, man.
we gotta bring you back for the marriage conversation on Worship and Word to see how you're navigating that. So tons of different perspectives and backgrounds that we have today on Worship and Word conversations. And our topic is righteous and relevant, how Christians should engage popular culture. So if you're just coming in, I need you to do two things. Number one, I need you to hit that share button. That's super, super important. I know the depth of our conversation today is going to be so great that you can't keep it to yourself. So hit that share button. The second thing, let us know in the comment section where you're joining us from so we can shout you out. Kanique says, Kevin, I can relate, being a third culture kid. So great feedback. Just like Kanique, feel free to drop some comments in the comment section and we'll shout you out. Before we go any further, Pastor Jay North, if you could, Doc, offer some prayer for us. We need some guidance and covering on this conversation.
Definitely. Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we just first and foremost thank you for today and all that you've given to us, all that we've experienced thus far. Lord, we're just asking that as we share our perspectives and our opinions, that you would just saturate our conversation, and that those who are watching and listening, Lord, would be blessed. And through this conversation, God, gain another dimension of another reality of what you are and what you're capable of doing in this specific time that we're living in. And thank you for this platform and Pierre and the vision to bring this thing together. And so we thank you already in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. So we got Waldorf, Maryland. We got Orlando, Florida as well. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Feel free to hit that share button and put something in the comments as well. So let's start this conversation. Let's frame this up in terms of your personal background and experience. What's something maybe from growing up as a kid that was maybe a fixture or staple in popular culture that you wanted to participate in, that you wanted to hang out and be a part of? I don't know if it was clothes or movie or whatever it is, but for whatever reason, there was some space between you and that thing. Like maybe your faith community said, don't do it. Maybe you couldn't afford it. What was that thing for me? It was the sneaker culture. You know, I grew up. You know, our family didn't have a lot for the things that I wanted. We had our needs covered, but I wanted to be a part of the sneaker culture so bad. And now I see the same sneakers I wanted as a kid on the shelves of Foot Locker for 2 and 3 times the price. But it was, and I was even made to feel like wanting those things and wanting to participate in culture that way was wrong. So what were some of the things for you going back and I'll start with you, Chris, something that you wanted as a kid that you wanted to be a part of that was part of mainstream or popular culture?
I'm sitting there like, don't pick me first. Don't pick me first. So it's okay. It's weird. As far as material things, I never really wanted much as a kid. So I wasn't a sneakerhead, or I didn't really think of owning a pair of Nikes was a necessity, or, you know, just something I really wanted to attain, even though it was a big deal in school. I went to public school, and, you know, we did the Air Forces, you know, we did even the Sauconys, for those of y'all that know those from back in the day. And it's like, I don't know. I think I was different. Like I remember telling my parents not to buy another game console after the Sega Genesis came out, and they bought that for Christmas because I knew that there would be another iteration after that. I'm not even like 15 yet. You know, we're still in middle school, maybe just getting into 6th grade. And it's interesting. I also never even felt the pressure to learn new songs. So even now, like, you know, certain songs come on and I can bop, but I don't know the lyrics. So it's weird for me that I guess maybe if I had to choose something, it will probably be in the tech space though. You know, and I think back then the tech for us before computers came were game consoles like Game Boys. And, you know, I had the Sega, my cousin had the Super NES. So I just go over to his house and we play NBA Live 95, you know? So, but yeah, so I think that would be it for me, would be the tech / entertainment stuff. Yeah.
Okay, tech / entertainment, and that's great that you bring that up in that perspective, Chris, because we realize that culture, a popular culture, is going to be different for all of us. You know, for Kevin in Sri Lanka is going to be one thing versus for Debbie growing up in her experiences. So, what about for you, Seth, as it relates to your interaction with popular culture growing up? What did that look like?
This is kind of a tricky question because I grew up an Adventist pastor's kid, but even in that relatively conservative culture in Minnesota, we never really had a lot of restrictions. I saw Star Wars with my dad when I was 4 years old, thought it was great. As a matter of fact, I told my wife and we were dating, like, you have to see Star Wars because you won't understand half the conversations in our house if you've not seen this movie. We went trick-or-treating. We celebrated Easter. They didn't give us like a free-for-all with entertainment and media, but it was never there was never like so much of a taboo thing, or they didn't really like build up a lot of fear around different things. But as far as kind of the one area I wanted to do more in but couldn't, whether it was because of economic reasons or the Sabbath, being a Seventh-day Adventist, from sundown Friday, you know, to sundown on Saturday is sort of a day of rest and worship and reconnection with family, nature, and those kind of things. And so I really wanted to get into acting. I wanted to be in children's theater, but that was always kind of off the table. And so I could never do that until I got to Union College and was able to do that in sort of a Adventist environment. But I could never do the kind of theater and acting that I wanted to as a kid. So that was one area.
Okay, I think like when you said that, some people perked up, and maybe that weren't perking up before when you start talking about the different cultural customs of your household and how you guys interacted with popular culture. So I see you getting warm in the comment section. Go ahead and jump in with your comments. All right, we're in a safe place. We're in a safe space here. Gerald says couldn't do Saturday sports. That was a thing for him. Donnell Cello said I wanted to play for Earth, Wind, and Fire. So we're seeing some cultural integration happening here in terms of people remembering. Justin Pierre says can't Ventus. Okay. I think I've heard that before as it relates to our particular faith community. Kanik says I have Caribbean parents, so my list is long. The list is long. Okay. All right. So Kevin, talk to us about, third culture, what it looks like for you. What were some popular culture things that you wanted to maybe be a part of, maybe that you participated in? And how did you and your family navigate that?
Right. No, it's a great question. I think one thing that a lot of people, especially here, Native Americans, don't understand. And when I say Native Americans, I'm not talking about the Indians here. I'm talking about people who grew up here in this country, is how pervasive American pop culture is throughout the globe. Because for me, when I grew up, if there's something that was hype in the States, it would just be a matter of maybe days till it got to us in Sri Lanka and in the Middle East. And so I remember, like watching MTV in Oman and in Sri Lanka was like a huge thing. And our parents would always like shield us from watching any of that stuff. It's like, no, none of that raunchy stuff, this and that. But for us, it was just like this symbol of like what we could be like, And so for me, particularly, I was really drawn into the culture of rap and hip hop. As a kid growing up in Sri Lanka, I mean, I couldn't rap to save my life. I couldn't do any of that stuff, but I just loved the hype around it, like the celebratory nature of it, and now in hindsight, I'm able to attach some vocabulary to it. But at the time, but I would say, just the storytelling aspect of it. Like I was so drawn into the entire culture, and so I wanted to wear baggy clothes, But my parents were like, "No, this is too big for you. Why don't you tailor your clothes?" So that's something that I really wanted to get into. But there was always this clash of different cultures, and so that's probably the one thing that I can remember.
Kanique says that I tried to listen to Kirk Franklin's Stomp. Kirk Franklin, the gospel artist, came out with an album called Stomp many years ago, and I guess the references to her parents. They almost threw out my boombox, and I remember that was very controversial when that album came out. That gospel album came out. It was a lot of conversations in churches about how we should wrestle with those things. We'll go to you, Debbie, and then Jay North will close off this section as it relates to things from your childhood or young adult years that were maybe cultural icons or draws for you and your family.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion that you're having, and it's really forcing me to like go way, way back. But I did not grow up Adventist, and so that's why it's also interesting to hear some of the the tug of war, so to speak, that you're having with the culture. It's interesting though that my name that my mother gave me, it's because she was influenced by popular culture. I was named after Debbie Reynolds. I look nothing like Debbie Reynolds. My sister, whose name is Raquel, was named after Raquel Welch. But this is growing up in the Caribbean, growing up in Jamaica, where Kevin, who said it took a while, and a child of the 70s, the 80s, took a while before things actually got to the island. But one of the things I do remember, though, which is what had an impact on my life and why I ended up following that route into journalism, was in Jamaica at the time. There was it was a time of political upheaval, and I just remember going into the stores and the shelves were empty. There were long lines that they could get to get gasoline. And I remember even not going to school. They would say, you can't go to school because our school uniform, it was the color of one of the political parties, and some of the students were getting harassed. And so that was something that had a huge impact in terms of with me now wanting to start to figure out why this was happening. And so I got hooked on news, literally addicted the news to try and figure out, okay, what's going on in my world and why are these things happening? So that was my early beginning and my years. We were raised as Anglicans, Church of England. And so the whole thing in terms of the do's and don'ts in my household, it was a little bit more relaxed. My parents expected us to go to church, but it wasn't this whole thing in terms of you can't do this, you can't do that. It was just make sure that it was more tradition, so to speak. Just be there on a Sunday morning and just, at the end of service, you come back home and you went back to your regular life. So that was my early beginning in terms of with religion and as it relates to popular culture.
Darren puts in the chat, the local rock station would play Christian rock for an hour on Sunday morning. I dutifully recorded those songs onto tape from my boombox. Man, he bringing back memories. I still don't think my parents were excited about that. And I know some of us who are watching now, or you're watching the replay of this, know that experience. You're old enough to that experience of putting masking tape over top of your cassette so that you could record the radio station and whatever popular songs were on, and you could, and if your household was maybe a bit stringent about those things, you would try to sneak off it and listen to the popular songs. So Jay North, talk to us, man. What was your experience like, especially as a ball player, pastor's kid? What was that experience like?
Well, my experience is a little different because my dad he wasn't pastoring, he was a chaplain in the military. And so for the first 12 years, I grew up on military bases or around that type of life. But man, listen, I was into it. I'm an 80s, 90s kid. So, I was into the Lakers, Celtics. I was into East Coast rap, start out with, Run DMC. And then, we moved out to California. And so got into West Coast rap. And then we moved back east. And so that whole East Coast, West Coast beef, I thought I was in it. I was heavy into, the starter jackets and, the Raiders gear, the whole antagonism toward the police. I was at a boarding school. I won't call the name up here. You might know about that school, but so our group, my race was in a minority. And so, we were feeling the oppression and we wanted to fight back. And so NWA was, oh man. So, that was what I kind of grew up with. My parents weren't extremely strict. I'm the youngest of 4, and I came 8 years after the last my twin sisters. And so my parents retired when I came along. So I got a dual cassette boombox at the age of 10, and my sisters lost it. They're like, what? And so that was my experience growing up. I loved just rap, hip hop, just was completely immersed in the whole culture, and break dancing, man. Now I wasn't, I couldn't spin on my head, y'all. And if you can see where I look now, you like, man, he couldn't spin it all. But listen, man, pop locking, all that stuff. What we were into, put down a cardboard box in the parking lot at school, and let somebody turn on, little music, and we pop locking around a cardboard box, man, and somebody backspin and try to windmill. So dance, sports, and music was just it was heavy, man. It was heavy.
So I think you hit a trifecta there: dance, sports, and music. And if we could throw it into a quad, if we throw movies into that, for a lot of us who come from a conservative religious background, that seems to be like the perfect square of death and doom to stay away from. But even in listening to the differences, let's talk about what popular culture is, because Chris is talking about video games and tech. Debbie's talking about political movements. Kevin and Pastor Jay North are talking about hip hop culture. Seth is talking about movies, and anybody can jump in on that. When we use the phrase pop culture or popular culture, what exactly are we talking about here?
I think one of the challenges, I was kind of sketching this out, prepping for this, and one of the challenges when you take the word culture, it's such a huge word that to try to pin any, like, this is the definition. It's kind of like the word nature or even communication. There's so much there that it's hard to get a definition. So for me, just kind of sketching stuff out, kind of keeping it broad, Pop culture is what the majority of a population considers meaningful. In other words, that includes language, that includes rituals, arts, entertainment. It's a huge thing. So whatever a large population says, this is what's meaningful, this is what expresses my life, my values. So that's kind of a general definition of what I would consider pop culture, but I want to temper it a little bit with another dynamic. When you talk about pop culture, especially in American history of pop culture, there's a lot of power dimensions there too. So you have this culture that maybe the masses create over against, and even critiquing the culture that those with power and privilege say that, you know, this is what's good for the people, this is the kind of art and entertainment we should have. And oftentimes even people in power trying to control what the masses feel is meaningful or a great expression of their reality in their life. So those kind of two things for me go together.
And we're seeing a lot how this is nuanced, as you were mentioning, Seth, you know, by the people groups, by the storytellers, by the influencers, because you could have things that are popular, and as Gerald Best points out in the comments, what's considered the thing of the day, but you can have multiple things of the day, at the same time, kind of competing against each other in some respect. And I'll go to you, Kevin, with this. And you spend a lot of time navigating popular culture. How do you see it through your lens?
Right. No, I really like that definition that Seth said, which is that popular culture, is something that is meaningful to a large group of people, regardless of where they are. I would even go as far as to say that it's a function of a particular worldview or a set of worldviews, right? So what I mean by that is, if you look at a movie, if you look at a song, it's not just a song, it's not just a movie. There's a story being communicated, and it's a function, it's a product of a worldview. And if I want to, we can go deep into this whole worldview situation. You guys know what we can spend hours and hours, days even. But for the sake of illustration, I'm thinking about it as a tree, right? You have tree, you have roots, trunk, branches. And when we look at like a cultural artifact or a pop cultural artifact, a lot of people see the fruit of it, but a lot of people don't realize that comes from a very robust network of roots, that taps into some of the power dynamic stuff that Seth was talking about, and a whole bunch of different things. And from that angst, from that frustration, you create a song, you create a movie. So when I look at pop culture, like one of the questions that I ask myself is like, hey, what is the story? Like, what story is this thing trying to communicate? Because and we can talk about this later on, because when you start from that point, then you can have a much more of a constructive conversation about pop culture. At least you can start from there.
Okay, so I'll go ahead, Jay North, if you want to jump in.
I mean, I kind of want to piggyback in terms of worldview. I kind of look at it as the set of lenses that you look at life through. And pop culture is just the most popular set of lenses that people choose to put on to interpret kind of the world around them, how they want to interact with it, how they want to understand it. And because, sometimes, for us on Saturdays, for many of us or most of us on Saturdays, we put on a certain lens and we interact, we behave, we interpret through that set of lenses. And then, after a certain hour, then a lot of us take that lens off and put the more popular lens on and start interacting and behaving and doing things. And it's not just one thing, but it's multiple things through that set of lenses, that worldview, as Kevin kind of shared.
So one of the things that we're wrestling with here is that with lenses or with worldview, how in your experience, how has the faith communities that you've been a part of, and Debbie, you talked about growing up in the Anglican church, Jay North, you talked about the Adventist subculture of life. How have, from your experience, from your lenses, how have you interpreted the response to popular culture? In the beginning, we talked about the things you wanted to be a part of or you admired. Now, as we talk about when we look at the quote unquote church, and I know church is a nebulous and far reaching term. When we talk about the church and popular culture, what has really been, in your viewpoint, the church's stance on what engagement should look like, or if it even should even happen at all?
Debbie?
Yeah, it's a, and I like the descriptions that I've heard so far in terms of what is popular culture. It is what is popular, by virtue of its word, the word, but it's also something that's very complicated because you have good and bad media. And so if you're to start now, and we haven't started coloring things, but in my mind and the lens, as you talked about, Jason, you start putting that on and the things that you start seeing and interacting. And so I'll give you an example as well in terms of, I told you a little bit about my background in terms of how I got into journalism, but it was interesting in terms of why I decided to pursue television journalism. And it's again, based on what I'm seeing coming through the media and those popular images that are, you just bombarded with, and deciding that instead of just being a consumer, need to be a producer, change the narrative, so to speak, rather than just talking the talk. So in that sense, when I look at it in terms of, what is media, it's something in terms of you shape what it is you think that media should reflect. And so working in journalism, that's why I decided I was tired of those images of young Black men, being depicted as, thugs. They're always the ones who you see with the mugshots, but not so much the experts. And so, again, it's one of those things whereby what is popular culture trying to feed me, but what is it I'm telling popular culture that we need to do? So it's a complicated thing, and it's how you actually react to it and how you decide that you want to change that narrative. And so that's where I'm coming from. And so it's interesting too, I'll just say this, because when I got to Andrews University, one of the first questions, and actually over the 7 years I was there, it's a consistent question that the students would keep saying to me, you left the world to come work for the church? That doesn't make any sense. So I see in terms of in the church that there is that tug of war and that struggle, so to speak, in terms of what it is that's considered good versus what's considered bad.
Yeah, I would just kind of say that in terms of in part of my experience, the church tried to deny the even existence that this stuff was even happening. And then in additional experience, depends on the part of the country you're in and where the case would be, the church was trying to stamp out those lenses that they felt were, outside of anything that they considered pure or right or holy. So they wanted just to crush it. I mean, have nothing to do with pop culture, popular culture, just, complete, even to the point of trying to deny its existence. So that's kind of my experience.
I want to dovetail to what Debbie and Jay said. I really, really appreciate that a lot. And I remember preaching sermon series on this. I think what we've done, we've taken Jesus' prayer in John 17, where he explicitly prays, keep them, in the world. And we kind of have this shorthand where like, don't be in the world. We sort of, make a shortened version of it. And we create this idea that the church is inside this sanctuary and the world is out there. So you've got these two separate realities. And the reality is, and this is going to maybe pain some people, the church can't escape culture. Even if you speak a known language on planet Earth, you are influenced, by popular culture. And so this idea that somehow I can be in this sanctuary and whew, I'm no longer, in the world. And when I hear that people use that phrase, and they've used it, different ages all over the place, they'll even say it kind of condescendingly, well, she's in the world. I'm like, where do you live? And I certainly understand that there are Christians that we might think, based on our interaction, they might live on another planet. But the bottom line is we all live here, and we're all influenced. And so I think we need a much better critical apparatus, a critical lens to look at what's good about, and I don't even like saying the culture, as if there's like one culture out there, or the pop culture. There's so many, I like the term cultural spheres. There's so many nuances to it. What is good here and what isn't maybe so good here. But this idea that somehow the church can escape culture and have this little spot somewhere on planet Earth that's totally untouched by it, to me is absolute nonsense.
So I want to chime in. Seth, you brought up a good point. That John 17, it's like they forgot about the first part of the verse. So I want to, Debbie, you're right. It's a complicated thing. Quite frankly, you have good media, bad media, and I think in the church too. You've got people that understand it, that misunderstand it, and people that manipulate it. So what I want to do is, just from a biblical perspective, look at some of the tensions that there are, because I'm gonna just read some stuff. So it says, John 17:15, it says, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but keep them from the evil one. We focus on they are not of the world, just like I am not of the world. But they forgot the first half of it. Keep them in it. Keep them in the culture, but protect them from the one who can influence the culture on them. So here's another one. You must no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds, or do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Now, these are great, right? But then we get to ones like 1 Corinthians 9:22. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. Or 1 Corinthians 10:32-33. Give no offense to Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many that may be saved. There is a tension here. How do you influence, or how do you be a part of the culture? How do you be if you can consider it a sea? The sea is the culture. Be in the water, but yet swim against the current. And it's a fine line. Quite frankly, I do believe that we are called as Christians to be countercultural. So for me, the church needs to take on the mantle of leveraging culture, if that makes sense. And we're probably going to talk about it later. I don't think the entire culture can be redeemed. If we can go there right now, I think elements of it can be, but not the entire thing. That's like trying to boil the ocean. If we're even using the same analogy of culture being an ocean, we can't do that. And I don't think we're called to do that, but it is complicated. I'll leave it there. But even in scripture, we've got both sides. And I think both sides are necessary. There's a delicate balance.
So just want to jump into what Chris was saying and Seth was saying. You guys brought up John 17. Acts 17 is also crazy. That's Paul in Athens, right? And I think some of you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
And this is verse Acts 17, verse 22. And just to give you a context, Paul's in Athens, and he's with all these idols all around him. And he walks into the meeting of all these people, and he says, "People of Athens, I see," verse 22, "that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and I looked carefully at your objects of worship, culture, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." What Paul is doing here is pretty crazy. Like, he is going into a group of people. It was pop culture for them. And he was saying, yo, you have this thing. Let me tell you about this thing that you think you know. This is a whole different, we don't even have time to go to where Paul is actually going here. But it again goes to show that even in that pop culture is not something we as Christians, we don't have the luxury to demonize culture, but we do have a responsibility to look at it and see with a critical eye where are the footprints of grace here, where is the presence of God moving in this place. So yeah, that's something that I come on, because you guys said John 17, I was thinking Acts 17.
So, and even in Acts 17, in that section where Paul is having that conversation, he pulls a reference, a piece of poetry, and the piece of poetry is actually a prayer or an ode to Zeus. and he's adapting that language, that framework, and having a conversation pointing people to Jesus. And what's the equivalent of that? And Kevin and Jay North, you talked about hip hop culture and rap. You could say the equivalent of pulling a lyric from a popular rap song and adapting it into the conversation that way, because the people who are listening would get that reference and be able to make a connection there. But I want to go back to something that Chris talked about, and something that Seth brought up as well, and everyone touched on it a bit, that when we say culture, we try to create this big sort of anathema thing. But even when we talk about culture in the church, we sometimes forget that our church, our faith communities, have their own popular subcultures. There's speakers who are popular depending on the topic or segment. There are regions of the world that are popular. So when we talk about the church and the world, sometimes I think we overlook the fact that even within our unique faith communities, we are wrestling with what's popular. And I can't remember who talked about it before, but even sometimes to the manipulation of things. And people love that particular manipulation, so that everyone jumps and follows and shares those videos or brings in that speaker, because that particular thing is popular, even within some of our faith communities. So let's talk about the question, and Seth, you could chime in too, as it relates to redeeming culture. I want to go there next, but go ahead, Seth. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I was just gonna dovetail off what you said. I think one thing we need to address too, for all the sort of hate that gets thrown at Hollywood and celebrity and pop culture, we need to deal with the celebrity culture that we've built inside the church. Uh-oh. When you look at some of these speakers that go running through on whatever platform they have, there are people who can get away with saying things that most pastors, most people get fired for, because they've got this platform, they've got this celebrity. I had a colleague tell me that he actually took a sermon. He didn't totally parrot it. He worked in some of his own illustrations, but took kind of the blocking of this sermon, preached it. And he had a church member come up to him and say, "I'm going to pray for you because you don't preach it like Brother Doug Batchelor preaches it." Like somehow that was wrong because he didn't mimic the celebrity preacher. The other thing that bothers me that I've seen, just kind of an illustration of the celebrity culture we've built inside the church without us even maybe realizing it, is that you will have a popular camp meeting speaker or convention speaker. Then you see the line of people that line up, and there are people that hold up the Bible. "Would you sign my Bible?" As if they wrote it, as if it's like the bestseller that they produced. And so we have this huge problem that we don't really address, that we have set up these celebrities.
Wow.
And maybe we need to be a little bit more careful. And I'm not against having a good platform or having a good reach for your message, but some of the things that we allow in terms of, I would even say, religious entertainment or religious celebrity that we've allowed, we need to maybe dial back a little bit.
Yeah, and then we all talk about platforms. Debbie, you're part of producing a magazine, and Seth, you teach communication. Kevin, you have a YouTube channel. So we're not against platforms and building a place to communicate a message, but we do have to be mindful of how we throw stones. And I think Linworth talked about it earlier in the comments. He said the importance of discernment. Kevin, you talked about this as well, of looking at something with an eye of grace. Where can we extend grace? And also how are we able as Christians to discern what's necessary or vital for us to connect to and to navigate or to steer away from? I got a whole list of questions. I think, did I cut you off, Kevin? I didn't mean to, but I wanted to talk about this quote from C.S. Lewis, attributed to C.S. Lewis, and the quote is, "The world does not need more Christian literature. What it needs is more Christians writing good literature." And I want to talk a little bit about how we feel about being excellent in our craft, not just in the church, but outside of the church, as a way to build bridges and connections with culture for the sake of reaching people for the cause of Christ. What does it look like to be like, do the things that we create, do they have to be uniquely Christian? What a better way to frame this is a popular hip hop artist named Lecrae several years ago said that he does not want to be known as a Christian rapper. He wants to be known as a rapper who just happens to be a Christian, so that better engagement with culture. Like, does it have to be? Is it all or nothing? Like, how do we navigate? And I know it's a sticky conversation, and feel free to chime in the comments as well as we go in this direction. But what, does it have to be labeled uniquely Christian? Because sometimes when we say Christian, the wider world says, because they look at history, they look at Middle Ages, they look at colonialism, they look at different things that were held under the auspice of the church, and their mind is, okay, if that's church, I don't want to have anything to do with it. So how do we kind of, it's sticky, but how do we navigate it? Jay North.
I don't know. I was thinking of this song with Nicki Minaj and
Tasha Cobbs,
and the song is hot. I mean, it just is. And there's a book that I've read that I've kind of adopted this philosophy. It's called The Everlasting Gospel in an Ever-Changing World. It's an excellent book. It's an excellent read, and it kind of just draws on the tension that you guys have talked about a little bit earlier. And it basically says this: there are times where we need to embrace popular culture. We need to be like Christ and, kind of engage the community. And there's a word for it that I completely blown right now. But anyhow, just kind of being part of the community and getting to know people and mixing and merging with people. And then there's a philosophy where people are like John the Baptist, where, hey, come and see a man, everybody come where we are, come where the safety is. And everybody can't do it. is what I take away from the book. Everybody can't do it. Everybody can't be the Devon Franklins of the world. Everybody can't be the Kirk Franklins of the world. Everybody cannot immerse themselves similarly in pop culture and still maintain their identity as a Christian. And so I just think it takes some discernment. It takes knowing yourself to be able to navigate that. But I definitely think there are people who need to push the envelope in terms of, getting in these places where, just the person who comes with, hey, I'm Christian. Hey, this is me. I love the Lord. They just come hard. It's going to be a little bit harder for them to engage individuals who potentially don't know God, don't know, aren't spiritual. I just think that there is a need for individuals to kind of immerse themselves into that world, but they know how to do it. They're prepared for do it. They're strong enough to do it, but it's not for everybody.
Feel free to jump in the comments. I know y'all talking at home about what we're talking about right now. Don't keep all that good stuff to yourself. Share it in the comments so that we can discuss around it. Seth, I know you've done a lot of research and study into C.S. Lewis and sort of his framework, and even, the things that have become part of popular culture with his writings and then later on movies. If you could kind of speak to, his kind of mindset as it relates to popular culture and faith, and then Chris, feel free to chime in after Seth.
Yeah, no, one of the really cool things I usually get to do, Rona took it away from me this year, but we do at Union a C.S. Lewis study tour. We look at faith, imagination, pop culture, and all this other stuff. And we can't do it this year. But one thing that we talk about explicitly, and this is why I really appreciate you bringing this quote up, is Lewis's approach to Narnia. A lot of people inside the church kind of view it, it's Christian fiction, it's an allegory. And he'll say, I never set out to write a Christian children's book series. What he did is he had all these images in his mind. He just wrote them on paper. He just kept sort of unloading what he had in his heart and his mind, and eventually it took shape. And he said he likes writing it that way because if you end up going into it, and I've written a couple kids' books within the Adventist Church, it's very tricky writing fiction as a conservative Christian, because there's certain talking points that publishers are going to want you to hit, and you run the risk of kind of breaking the fourth wall or just talking to people in your own faith tradition. And so what Lewis did is he says it's a scary way to write fiction, because you put all these images out on paper, and it's sort of that out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks verse. You get to see what's really going on in your heart then. Do I really have a Christian worldview? Because even if you don't set out to explicitly write a Christian book series, those images as they show up on paper or on film, whatever you're doing, you'll kind of get to see this is the worldview that's coming. This is what's actually going on in my heart. And so it's really neat to, as he comments, not just on this writing method, but the reason we do fiction this way that isn't sort of in your face apologetics is a lot of people, Lewis's term is stealing past the watchful dragons. A lot of people are not going to take just a full frontal polemical apologetic assault. They're not going to listen to that sermon. They will pick up a book and read it. And then in the course of reading, it can soften the soil, so to speak. It kind of opens them up to different ideas. There's actually a lot of writers in the 19th century writing Victorian ghost stories who had a Christian worldview with the idea of trying to break through a secular, closed, worldview kind of mindset, trying to scare the reader into thinking, well, what if there is more to this life? So it's a form of communication that in some ways is indirect, trying to, again, sneak past the watchful dragons. But yeah, that's he wasn't wanting to write to that niche market. I'm not saying there isn't room for that. We certainly need to have dialogue in our faith traditions and communities. But should we only be talking to ourselves? Should we only use language and symbols and imagery that's familiar to us? And so to be able to create a story that still has those Christian themes and values, putting it into a story that everyone can appreciate, I think has a lot of value. And I think that's that quote, let's just be Christians writing good literature out of what we feel is truth, and not trying to arbitrarily make it Christian that only speaks to people who are familiar with our Christian subcultures.
Chris, after you chime in, I want Kevin to talk about his usage of pop culture references as it relates to some of your videos, and how you share the gospel through some of these icons of culture that you do very masterfully, and even some of the pushback or consternation you received as a result of that. And we'll get to that after we hear from Chris.
This struck a chord. You probably saw me itching like, yeah, I want it, because so two things, and I hope I do this justice. Speaking to Seth's point, the popular culture, which by the way, when I heard pop music, when I say up until recently, I mean like up until we were supposed to do this, I thought pop was just like pop for music. I didn't realize it was popular, like pop culture. I'll be honest with you. I'm not the only one, but I really just thought it was like a genre, not realizing that it's a mixture of genres or a blend, just like popular culture is the amalgamation of just everything. It's a mess, right? Which is a dichotomy to live in an individualistic society, but yet still have everybody. It's a mess, right? So the pop culture, so to speak, in biblical times was speaking in parables or stories. This was the C.S. Lewis back then. And he even did it in such a way, and I think this is so important. He spoke in one of the channels of pop culture, if that makes sense. So right now, pop culture is mainstream or commercialized music, movies, food. It's major streams, and I believe that the people who have a platform that can influence or reflects popular culture have to be very strategic as Christians. I even want to say that Lecrae's, I'm not a Christian rapper, I'm just a rapper who happens to be Christian. Even that you have to be careful with too. I'm at a point now where I think that it's not black and white, but it's got to be darn near close, where that, okay, I'm a rapper that just happens to be Christian, but just know that I am strategically placing each and every one of these lyrics and these bars so that you can go back to it. Do you know that there are people who go back and listen to Eminem's or whoever's lines and they just decipher the whole thing and say, yo, I didn't realize that. That's what the parables were like, I believe, with Jesus, where when you decided to really dig deep and to understand it, oftentimes, even the disciples were like, Jesus, what you talking about? Like, what does that mean? And he said, listen, y'all still don't get it? And there were people that actually did get it. So I say that to say, Jesus leveraged that particular area, that channel, that media, so to speak, in popular culture for a very strategic reason. You may not have caught it the first time, but when you do, it points back to Christianity. Well, it points back to him. Let me not use the word Christian. It points back to Jesus himself. It points back to the kingdom of heaven. The majority of his parables began like the kingdom of heaven is like. So, okay. So the second thing is this. Pierre, I don't know if you remember this. In 2006, there was a poetry slam competition at the University of Georgia, and I was still going at Andrews, and I decided to fly from Michigan to Georgia just for that day, crashed at a relative's house for the night, and then I competed and flew back to school. And I can't remember why I did it. I think it was because I wanted to bridge a creative, not a gap, but some sort of relationship between the student movement there and the student movement at Andrews. And whatever the case, I came, and all I had with me for my poetry, back then, that's what I did. It was all Christ-based. Like, it was all spiritual. There was nothing really secular about them. That's all I had. So I went there and I did it. I competed, and lo and behold, I'm the first person to go up. And as I go up, I don't even know, and this is the thing why this is so important. I didn't even know if I intentionally said, I'm going to turn this thing out, and we're going to all focus on something different. I didn't. I just went, did the pieces that I had, and everybody else after me were like, so it's that kind of slam. Okay. There was no cursing. It was positivity. It was uplifting, but it was also pointing to God. And I think that that's what makes the difference when we're talking about being an influencer in popular culture. I'm gonna shut up. Kevin, you can go ahead. Is if it's just positive and if it's just uplifting, that's cool, but it's not enough. It has to point back to God. So C.S. Lewis, I truly believe that he strategically had it point back to God. If we are in mainstream media and we're not doing these things, then we're losing it. So here's the thing. Here's the last thing. So now you have individuals, and I don't want to call out names, but you have Christian rappers now who aren't really using, and it's tough. They're not using the word Jesus in their lyrics, and you don't have to. You don't have to. And there are people that now complain about, you sold out. Nah, that's the other extreme. But now there's a slippery slope where all of your music, especially if, let's say, you didn't necessarily strategically want to hit mainstream radio so people could know who you are and maybe go to your previous records or whatever the case is and then be drawn to Christ. It's a slippery slope where now you kind of stay neutral. And there's nothing really in each song that's hitting you back to Christ, or a story arc in an album that's hitting you to Christ. Not every verse has to hit you to Christ, but you gotta have an end game. And I think that a lot of artists or a lot of people right now who are trying to be neutral in pop culture don't have the end game of pointing us back to Christ. Kevin, I hope that helps something, but it's a lot. I have so much, I can't even really unpack it, but I hope I did justice to it.
So before Kevin jumps in, I want to go back to something that Debbie referenced in relationship to your experience, Chris, in being producers of culture. So you go into, because there are some people that say, why would you go to a poetry slam? Right? Why would you enter that cultural paradigm? It doesn't matter that you're going to talk about Jesus. The fact that you're going to a poetry slam and it's not a church service, it's not a block party, which is like a safe thing, or an afternoon youth program. You stepped into a culture different from your own. And I think somebody put in the comments, we're afraid of being in spaces with people who are not like us because we're afraid of what they would say. But even your willingness to go in and produce something in this culture talks about the power of engagement in popular culture. Kevin, go ahead.
Can I just say one last thing, Kevin, before you go?
No.
You can say multiple things, brother. Go ahead, man.
So what ended up happening was we almost had church by the end of the slam. There wasn't even any prizes given out like there was supposed to be. Like, the competition became a worship experience. But after that experience was over, the culture was the same. So that's why I don't believe that we can change. The goal isn't to change the entire University of Georgia now to worship Christ. You can't do that. Not all things are possible, but you know what I'm trying to say. It's not wise to try to go ahead and do it that way. All things kind of start in a grassroots way, and then it, flourishes. So all of that to say, I didn't go to try to have church. I just went with my truth. And my truth influenced other people who know what spoken word is to say, man, okay, I got it. And even I had a trip up because eventually I went to poetry lounges and I did stop doing Christian related or Christ-centered pieces. And my stuff got real neutral. I got more snaps and rewinds, but that was it. I ain't get nothing else. So all of that to say, yeah, it's a slippery slope.
I gotta let Debbie answer before. We keep bumping Kevin. Kevin gonna be mad, but I mentioned Debbie, so I gotta let her respond.
Yeah, just real quick, and it's real interesting what you're saying, Chris, and also what you had said, Jason, with regards to entering that space as a Christian, because one of the things I'll remember, and it's a nuanced subject. Mm-hmm. Because it depends on the level of how deep your faith is. And so I know for me, the reason why I left NBC is because I had been there as a non-Christian for 10 years, and then I became a Christian. Could I have continued to walk in that space? Probably. But guess what? People who I had hung out with, and then all of a sudden you start saying, praise the Lord. They ask you, so how you doing? And you're like, God is good. So the thing is this, I think that it's the audience, and again, as a good communicator, figuring out who it is that you're speaking to, because I had to make a clean break with the company, with the friends I had, with the things that I had been listening to, because you can easily, as you mentioned, Chris, get sucked back into that lifestyle if you don't have that deep connection to God. So it's something you have to be so careful about. So that's what I wanted to just say.
Listen, now we start stirring up the comments. I told y'all to get involved earlier. Now they were almost at the end. Y'all want to jump in and make all these comments. It's been a really refreshing conversation, and we have some questions in the chat that I want to get to, but we got to let Kevin share from his expertise as it relates to pop culture references and navigating, and as Chris talked about, kind of using those examples to point people in a certain direction. Yeah, no, it was so good. Thanks for sharing, guys. So I have this YouTube channel. It's called Cross Culture Christian, and basically it's just the whole channel is basically about how what I can learn from other cultures as that pertain to Christianity and to the gospel. And so I started doing these videos for my youth group. So the titles of the videos were like the gospel, the Adventism according to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or would be like I just recently did one was like what does Ant-Man teach you about leadership? So stuff like that. So, I mean, I'm a huge MCU guy and Star Wars and all these different things. Like I'm so into all those different artifacts. And I was just like, I want to see how we can better use these things to communicate. And so that's how this whole thing started. So that's kind of what I do on the side. And when I look at any pop culture reference or artifacts, I ask a couple of questions that kind of help me make sense of it. And the first question is like, what's the story? Like that's something that I actually mentioned earlier. Like, what's the story about? What's the world of the pop culture medium? What are the people like? What are the issues? And then like, where am I? Like, what's my story? So how does the gospel inform my world, right? Then the next thing is like, what's true and good about that thing? That's the third question. And the fourth question is like, what's ugly and perverse about that thing? And then the last thing is like, how does the gospel apply? And so basically, I go through these questions and try to write down answers to some of these questions. And this is probably like my just humble attempt of like trying to figure out how to
best get whatever I can get from this thing. Because if you just stop at like what does this thing talk about Jesus, then you're actually doing a disservice, because every single cultural artifact has limitations, right? Like every single thing. So you also have to point those things out. But if that's your lead, like if you start from there, like, hey, this is why it's bad, then you've already burned that bridge. You start from the other stuff. That reminds me of this quote by theologian Kevin Van Hooser, and he basically says how like popular culture rarely influences our worldviews directly. I love this. He says, instead of addressing our belief systems head on, cultural works structure our daily practices and colonize our imaginations. Colonize our imaginations. I just love that, because he basically talks about like how these things, they're not just, but it affects something deeper. And I would say as Christians, we have actually colonized popular culture, right, to serve our own purposes. In many ways, and by actually minimizing the storyline to actually communicate the gospel. You don't want to do that too, because when someone who's secular, when someone who is not even who's not even interested in Jesus finds out that this whole the episode 3 of Star Wars was just used as a prop for the gospel, it's gonna make them even more mad. So you got to be very, very careful as to how you're gonna use some of these things, and that's something that I'm learning right now. And this is some of the feedback that I've received from people too, as to, hey, don't be careful of these things. So it's like it's a fine balance. You gotta move forward with that, and then and the biggest reason that I wanted to get into is because of empathy. Really, when you step into somebody's world, it's a posture of empathy. When you start from your world, it's really not. You have to step into their world. You need to understand where they're going through, what they're going through, what's the storyline. And I think English professors and even communication, I wish I'd spend a little bit more time in Pierre's class in communication, because like I wish I would learn to like dissect storylines and all these different things, because all those things are so important, and I think we should learn to do more of that stuff right now.
You raised something very important that really value what you said, but something to pull out just to give people in the comment section is the power of dissecting the story. And we heard it from Debbie, her framework and her narrative. You have left NBC and changed positions, but in the context of Debbie, how you framed your story, I understand more about you and your background and your journey. And it's the same with all of us. We look at a thing, or we look at a person, we look at somebody with that Five Below t-shirt of Star Wars or Darth Vader, or, we look at someone that says, I love haystacks on their t-shirt or whatever, and we instantly put them in a category. And a lot of times we paint everything with the same blue tone brush and never dig into the story of that person's journey and what's happening with them. And that call to discernment is also a call to discovering of people's stories as well. So there's a question that came up in the chat that I want us to wrestle with before we leave. And I know we're 7 minutes early, but I think it's a very, very, very poignant question. The question is, should you identify yourself as a Christian early when interacting on a non-Christian platform? Should you identify yourself as a Christian early when interacting on a non-Christian platform? That'll be our final question. We'll let it ride out after that. We can play rock, paper, scissors to see who wants to handle that first. But from your perspective and from the places where you guys live, work, and play and find community, if I'm invited to be a guest lecturer at a conference, Seth, or a poetry slam, or part of a panel discussion on people who've worked in the news media, or someone who works with the young adult population, whatever it is, should I start with, hey, in my bio or in the leading up conversation, and just so you know, I'm a Christian? Is that the way to do it? Does it have to be said? No, what's your take on that? And share that in the comment section as well. This is our last question, and we'll let this great panel of guests go. So love your response in the comment section. If I'm a Christian interacting on a non-Christian platform or workspace or whatever it is, do I need to lead with or introduce myself as someone as having a Christian background?
Okay, I'll fall on the sword first. I think of Matthew 5, a light on the hill, can't be hidden. I heavily paraphrase that. And then you are the salt of the earth. I think in popular culture, you won't need to, because you only see the light when it's dark. And for all intents and purposes, popular culture in its secularism is dark. It doesn't illuminate Christ, so to speak. So, Pierre, I go to WeWork. We always have standing meetings. Standing meetings always have drinks. Or we always, like, there are certain jokes that are made. Like, there are certain things that happen where I don't have to be like, nah, I don't do that, I'm a Christian. Just declining consistently begs the question,
why not?
Yeah. And the thing is, we don't have to do well, I don't, because that's oftentimes what I guess why we come up with the term can't Venice, right? But the problem with popular culture is they do everything. And I think that's why the 10 Commandments were written in a thou shalt not, don't do, because we need restraint. I think that's why as babies, you tell them more no than yes. There's no restraint or discipline. So I think that in your Christian walk, for me having the restraint and the discipline and saying those no's in appropriate times says, oh, wow, okay, this dude is serious about something. Why? And I think that's what really makes it stand out. You being a Christian doesn't have to be articulated verbally most times, because the popular culture is already doing everything.
Hey, Pierre, man, I have struggled with this title of pastor ever since it was laid on me.
Join the club, Doc.
And so I'm torn. In all honesty, I do not introduce myself as Pastor North. I introduce myself as Jason J. North, whatever. And inevitably, at some point in the interaction conversation, they'll ask what I do, or somehow, it may come out. And maybe it's a bad reflection on me, but they're always shocked. Maybe it's my look. I don't know, but they're like, "Oh man, you're a pastor." And the reason many have given is because I just don't carry myself as if I'm better than other people. I guess I don't know if that's a stigmatism on pastors. I'm not sure.
That's a whole different worshiping word, Doc. Yeah, that's a whole.
So no. In answer to that question, no, I don't think you have to overtly come out and declare where you stand in terms of your beliefs. I think if you're put in a position where your beliefs, where your beliefs, someone's asked you to compromise your beliefs, I think you share that, or from a job perspective, that type of situation. But just, I think that who you are authentically, if you are a follower, a disciple, I think that thing will come out, and people will be able to tell that there is something different about you. And I think that's the opportunity to impact popular culture when people see, and I saw it in some of the comments, that authenticity, that you're real, you're who you are, and you don't have to be overt, as if your whole identity is wrapped up more so in your religion or your denomination, as opposed to being a follower of Jesus.
Hugh Davis says in the comment section, you lead with what your values are. All Christians are different, but values speak to who you are. Go ahead, Seth.
Yeah, I agree with Chris and Jay. There's a quote by Kierkegaard, Søren Kierkegaard, that I fell in love with a few years ago. And he says, there's something missing in Christian. This is kind of a paraphrase, but essentially, there's something missing in Christianity, and it's not information. And what he means by that is, we've got all these books, all these, T-shirts and billboards and movies and everything else. We've got our own. What we need to see is people really embodying things. We need to see it. We need to experience it. And so I don't feel any compulsion, whether I am doing a camp meeting speaker, or if I'm doing consulting with a secular company on communication, to just broadcast, hey, I used to be a pastor and I'm a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, and I need to break out the charts from Daniel and Revelation, walk you through. I don't feel that compulsion, unless somebody were to randomly ask. But when I've been in, whether it's Twitter, whether it's been in consulting, sometimes what I've been able to do is saying, I spent time as a pastor, or I remember this one story. And by couching it in a story that way and sharing my experience, it sort of indirectly lets them know, yeah, I've got a Christian background, without shoving it, in their face. And sometimes I'll get people coming up, oh, so you used to pastor, or you used to live over here, and it just opens up. It's much easier to dialogue that way. But this sort of arbitrary having to slap, the Christian label, or Baptist, Methodist, whatever, tradition you're in, I have not found it to be necessary.
Debbie, what you thinking? I know I see you chewing on something there. Let us in on what you're thinking.
Well, the thing is this, I have not had to go through that. I'm, coming out of the secular world into the Christian world, but I was just thinking, if I had to go back in, is it something that I would, want to say up front? And I'm thinking, yeah. And actually, maybe not necessarily so much the Christian, but the Seventh-day Adventist part of it, because that becomes, a critical part of the question. But I think by your fruit, people will know who you are. And I do agree with you, Jason and Seth, that it's not necessarily something that you need, because it can be as well something where people just kind of run in the opposite direction. I know in terms of what I'm facing now, I'm the only Seventh-day Adventist in my family. And even as we speak, the things that I share online, I'm doing it with the intention of trying to woo my family, so to speak. I'm not speaking to Adventists for the most part when I'm online, but it's something whereby, like I said, by your fruit and by showing that you care. Mm-hmm. And this is probably, this is, a personal thing at this point, and not necessarily whereby, the populace in terms of how you're living, but by your fruit, they will know you. And it's not something you necessarily have to put on blast, but yeah. So that's where I'm coming from. That's what I was chewing on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kevin, you got two responsibilities. One, you have to pray us out at the conclusion, but give us some parting words and thoughts as it relates to how we present ourselves as Christians.
Oh man, well, I know Seth shared a quote that was instructive. Something else, another quote that is instructive to me recently, at least in these situations, is from Lincoln or Twain. I'm not really sure, but he says, better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak out and remove all doubt. And so I try to practice that as much as possible. But really, something crazy happened just yesterday. I was dabbling on TikTok. So my kids are on it, whatever. I just want to see what the whole thing is about. So I posted this video of me making chai. And I had about 200 whatever followers before this, nothing crazy, family, friends. But 2 days later, I'm at 6,000, and like that whole thing went viral. And like it was like 700,000 views or whatever, just for that chai video. Now I have all these followers who are not necessarily Christian, not necessarily Adventist, actually people who don't even it's like I have everybody from like a witch to a wizard, as they identify all sorts of things. And so this is a question that I'm struggling with right now. Like, okay, what do I do? Because in my bio, I have youth pastor, Adventist, Christian, and I like chai. That's my bio on TikTok. And so I'm like, so now should I now change this whole thing? Now should I just like completely get rid of it? Because are they going to be offended by all this stuff, But man, like I've been thinking about this, and to be honest with you, this is something that I'm still wrestling with. But a verse that's really giving me clarity to this question and to this situation is Jesus' first question to his disciples in the book of John. The disciples come to him, and then the first question that Jesus asked him is, "What do you want? What do you want?" And that was his lead. Like, it wasn't like, "Yo, I'm the Messiah, come through." It was more like, "Hey, what do you want?" And then that's how they started. And so for me, with this platform, this is a very practical application for me. You guys are helping me process this more. Is I'm gonna still have that bio in there, and I'm gonna still make chai. I'm gonna still give the people what they want, not the apostasy that is the Starbucks chai tea latte, but the real deal, right? But in the process, if they want to know more about Jesus, if they want to know more about Christianity or Adventism, yo, there's the comment section. You can communicate with me, and I want, like, people. I think more Christians should be they should do ministry from that from their talents and gifts as well, because we have such a small, narrow view of ministry. We think that ministry is just when we talk to them about Jesus. But what if ministry is serving the need of somebody from the gifts and the talents that you have? That is ministry too, And so you're not compromising yourself. You're not compromising your identity. You're serving from that identity. You're serving from that place that Jesus has called you to, So that's kind of where I'm at. And I think a lot of people should be. And I'm just trying to figure this thing out by myself. So let's see how it works.
we love the practical application in wrestling, and it just shows, for those of you who are watching us live or the replay, that we're all wrestling with this as well, how to navigate culture and even the subcultures and the subcultures of where we come from. But we are blessed to be able to go on this journey and have the God of God's word to walk with us. So I want to thank all of my guests for hanging out with us. Dr. Seth Pierce, Pastor Jay North, Debbie Michelle, Christopher Bartley, and Pastor Kevin Wilson. Kevin, can you pray for us as we let the folks go? I know y'all quarantine and you ain't got nowhere to go, but I got to let our guests go to enjoy the rest of their afternoon.
All right, let's pray. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for even the capacities that you've given us to process through these questions and to wrestle with some of these issues, Lord. You've put us in the world not to be compromised by it, but to serve it, Lord. And this is what we have. This is the planet that we have. So I pray that you would sensitize our hearts, sensitize our minds to the frequency of your voice at all times. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Want to invite all of you to join us on Friday evenings at 7:30 Eastern for worship and word, and Saturday afternoons at 4:30 p.m. Eastern for worship and word conversations. We'll see you next time.
All right.